Good morning. We are about to kick off another episode of Dancing with Change in FM, and I'm very pleased to be having a conversation with Mathias Young. His company is Engineered Corrosion Solutions, and Mathias is a consulting engineer at this company, and they are leading the organization in professional services for facility managers with the focus actually on corrosion in fire sprinkler systems. So we've got lots to talk about here, I'm certain, and have discussions about changes that Mathias is seeing in the workplace in FM. So on that note, what is it that is catching your attention right now and the attention of your business, Matthias?
Yeah, thanks for the warm introduction, Kathleen. I appreciate it. So yeah, like you mentioned, Engineer Corrosion Solutions, we're a company that's been working with facility managers for the better part of 15 years now, specifically on the issue of corrosion in fire sprinkler systems. And we were really at present at the inception of this problem. If we can, I'd like to get into some of the things that even created this thing in the first place, but ultimately, throughout these years that we've been working with facility managers and other folks in the industry, we've noticed a lot of changes, specifically about how facility managers now are moving to be more proactive. Really, they need to be more proactive about these things. They want the data to be able to proactively manage the life cycle costs of their assets. No more waiting for things to break and then having to fix them very disruptively. They want the data to be able to tell them what they need to do and be proactive. And then ultimately, we've seen this kind of connection between facility managers and other parts of the business, right? Especially when we're dealing with life safety systems in the fire sprinkler industry, this is an important part of the building that's often very much overlooked, right? It's the last thing on many people's punch list when they think about the sprinkler pipes that are above their heads every day. But in a sense of, well, I'm thinking about the business and I'm thinking about risk from a business level. It's very important, these life safety systems, because if they go wrong, if they're not maintained correctly, if they're not there to function when they need to function, it's ultimately very catastrophic, and it can impact things like insurance premiums, how the business is run, kind of strategic planning at the leadership level, and things like that. So all of those things combined, we've seen from this kind of this context of the fire sprinkler system and the degradation that corrosion causes. But I think that they're very much indicative of trends overall in the facility management industry, and all good things that are happening because of it. So that's kind of the gist of everything, and what we've seen.
I think that's fascinating because just like facility managers, I'm certain that you are encountering sprinkler systems of varying ages, varying iterations of different solutions and different types of metals and also different setups. But yeah, they are kind of out of sight and frequently then out of mind. So how are you actually addressing these kinds of differences?
Well, I think you kind of got to the root of the problem a little bit in that, sprinkler systems have been around for a long time, and some of the things about them actually have changed over the course of the past 20 or 30 years that have made them more of a problem to deal with and more also important to make sure that we're managing them correctly. I'll give you a little bit of background. Um, Sprinkler systems have been around for the better part of, most of the 20th century. And for a long time, it's exactly like you mentioned. We hung the pipes in the air, we put them into service, and then we left them be. And hopefully they worked in the case of a fire, and in many times they did. But ultimately, it was better than not having any fire sprinkler systems. Much better, because when they do operate, they operate very effectively. Um, so we kind of went along that track for a long time until about the mid 90s, when certain industry practices really made the degradation and corrosion damage inside sprinkler systems much more of a problem. Without getting too much into the weeds, really we started using thinner pipe. Back in the day, I'll say back in the day, we used to use very thick pipe for these sprinkler pipes, and so they could really stay in place for a long period of time. ultimately to the point where they would outlast the life of the building, or they would outlast a period where you might be doing a large remodel project, and then you've got that kind of window to go replace some of the fire sprinkler system components. So we started using thinner pipe. We also did a couple other things. We started testing them and taking them out of service and putting them back in service much more frequently. And actually just the act of taking the system out of service and inspecting it and doing things on it will actually cause degradation to accelerate. And then we started using different types of systems. Now in many high-risk applications like data centers and buildings of those nature, we use dry systems, we use pre-action systems, we use systems that are otherwise designed to operate a little bit differently, but ultimately their design makes for degradation and corrosion to those things actually accelerate. And so we kind of went to this point, and then in the mid-90s, we started changing all these things, ultimately for good reasons, right? But the result is that the degradation is now much accelerated, and we're seeing problems. And specifically, we're seeing a lot of problems today. We're seeing this problem explode today because those systems that we put in the mid-90s, early 2000s, up until about 2010, we're seeing those now reach the age where the problems are kind of rearing their head into our day-to-day operations. And specifically, many facility managers who are listening to this, are probably very familiar with corrosion and fire sprinkler systems manifesting itself as pinhole leaks, right? So I've got this piping up in the air, and now suddenly it's leaking water onto my facility. And of course, that's a huge disruption to operations. It's really a big problem because leaks of this nature, first of all, they cost a lot of money. They cost a lot to repair, but they also create downtime and operational disruption that us as facility managers really don't like to deal with, and ultimately it's going to prevent everybody else in the facility from doing what they need to do. And then second is, we're seeing this more and more, and it's actually what our company focuses on very closely is, what do we do when we have this problem, right? Historically, we haven't had to deal with, this problem coming up before the building was either so old that it needed a big remodel project, or maybe we were going to decommission the building because it was now 30 or 40 years old, right? And so we're having this problem in a building that may be 15, 20 years old, and everything else in the building is in great condition, and now we've got the sprinkler system that's having problems. So what do we do? And we see a lot of times it's we go right to the total system replacement option.
Really?
Right. And this is, yeah, it's an industry practice that's, it was applicable back in the day, but now when we're dealing with a live facility, it's a little bit more untenable, right? So when we've got this kind of damage that's happening on a regular basis, these problems, these leak problems that are happening on a regular basis, what do? We say, okay, well, it's time to replace the sprinkler system, because that's what we used to do, after its useful life. But this is, of course, a huge problem if you can imagine replacing a sprinkler system in a live facility, right? First of all, it's going to be very expensive. But second of all, the operational disruption is going to be massive.
It's huge. I've
Yeah.
been involved in a project like that, and it's insane. Absolutely. So, what's the challenge now, and how do you address that?
So the biggest thing is we've seen facility managers do two things that are really key in trying to address this problem. The first is, facility managers, if they can help it, if they're involved in the process of, designing and constructing new buildings, we're seeing the industry definitely move to a place where corrosion control technologies and technologies that are going to ultimately prevent this process from degrading the piping are being implemented more and more. And that's great because, corrosion control technology is, number one, it's extremely effective. It will work, and it will work in prolonging the life of the system, ultimately prolonging it long enough where it will outlast the lifespan of the building, and ultimately, in worst case scenario, it'll outlast, your major remodel period. And two, corrosion control technology is now offered by many manufacturers. ECS is one of those, but there are others out there that are doing good work as well. And it's being specified on more and more construction projects, and more installers now are familiar with it and able to kind of implement this into new building technologies. So if you can do this, if you're if you can be on the leading edge of a new building that's being constructed, if you have input in this process, facility managers are kind of really advocating for avoiding this problem in the first place, which ultimately makes all the problems that we've already discussed kind of go away. If you can address this on the front end, that's wonderful.
Oh, I totally support that. In fact, I think that's likely a change that we need advocate for, and that's having facility management be front and center in putting together requirements, being very actively involved in the design and construction process of any buildings so that they actually are fine with the results of that effort and that they've had some positive input into because of these reasons.
Well, it's the right group of people to ask, I think, because they're the folks that have to deal with any problems that happen after the building's, commissioned, right? So,
Totally.
yeah, for those that can affect it, I'd say it's very important for facility managers to be part of the design and construction phase.
So here's a question too. I just kind of wanted to get your input on. I mean, to the extent that we're talking about facility managers being more actively involved in design and construction, I've been pondering how involved facility managers are in insurance discussions with organizations, particularly as it, you know, re, as it pertains to the physical environment, and also how involved facility managers are in the putting together the specifications, if you will, for the procurement side of things. So that is certainly part of the the influence of how facilities function and then how facility managers can respond. So it's really, I think, inviting facility managers to be quite actively engaged in the whole life cycle and even imagining the beginning of a life cycle so that they can get the process on the right track. So, have you had any feedback from facility managers around either involvement in insurance negotiations and writing specs for procurement too?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. And I did some special digging before our chat today about this topic in particular, and it definitely depends. Right? I cannot give you a straight answer because it really depends. It depends on first what type of facility you manage, and then of course what insurance company that you're working with, and then of course how your organization is organized in the first place. I actually my wife works for an insurance company and she is involved in these discussions, but there are others in the industry that don't take as much of an involvement with the facility management teams when they do this. I will say though, there are insurance companies and there are organizations, facility management organizations that do take a very active role, and I think that's important. And I think the point that we know, and most of us in the industry know, is that it is very important to take an active role when you're having the discussions with the insurance company, especially for life safety systems like the fire sprinkler system. And
Absolutely.
it's so important because the risk of getting it wrong, the risk of not maintaining these systems correctly, it's not just like you lose air conditioning for the day. Yes, that's important, but it's not going to cause a loss. The risk that you don't maintain these fire suppression systems and fire life safety systems is that ultimately the worst case scenario is you have a total loss of the building. I can give you a little vignette. I've been to hundreds of job sites at this point to help facility managers and other clients deal with corrosion problems that they're having. And something that happens all too often is, let's say, as an example, I have 6 systems in my building, 6 fire sprinkler systems in my building. The systems are now 25 years old. They gotten to the point where leaks have started. There's small leaks, and yes, these are a nuisance, but they only seem like a nuisance on the surface level. What's more insidious here is when these leaks happen, sometimes they happen over inaccessible areas, sometimes they happen over a live production environment. And the temptation is there to defer what you're doing in the building to your fire sprinkler system. And how that manifests is that sometimes the fire sprinkler systems will be turned off, taken out of service, and waiting to get them fixed, or maybe waiting on approval from some other part of the organization to sign a purchase order to get them fixed, etc. I can remember one building, it was exactly like this scenario. They had 6 systems. There were pinhole leaks over essentially a space that was not readily accessible by any maintenance contractor or the facilities personnel, but it was still causing problems. It was causing water damage in other adjacent areas. And so what the personnel there decided to do was take those systems out of service. Well, the problem was it ended up removing all fire protection from about half of the square footage of the facility. And in the worst case, one of the systems had been out of service for close to 6 months. And
Wow.
so when you're looking at this from an insurance perspective, right, this is a huge problem, because if you have a small fire in the facility, when the sprinkler system works as designed, it's very, very effective at controlling that fire and ultimately limiting the risk to as small as possible. But when they're taken out of service, when they're not working correctly, or really when degradation has reached a point where they're just not going to be able to work correctly, this is a huge problem, because the risk of loss now has become, uncontrollable. And so, these conversations, I think, need to be happening between the facilities management personnel, the finance team, or whoever in the organization really is the kind of leadership with the insurance companies. And then also there's an onus on the insurance companies to go to the facility management team and the company and say, hey, we realize that you guys are maybe you're taking steps to proactively address this stuff. Maybe you have policies in place that make sure that the systems aren't going to be taken out of service if they're degraded or whatever it is, and then we're going to give you a benefit on your premiums because of that. So it's something we've seen kind of the nascent stages of in the industry, but ultimately I think the step that we need to take now is to make sure those conversations are at least happening so that we can kind of keep tabs on what's going on.
Yeah, I think this information and this history really helps to build the business case. And that's something that I think facility managers can really take advantage of, is this kind of experience, and have these conversations with their organization about not only, minimizing risk, but that it's a financial advantage to do so. Actually, as you were talking about that, I was just getting this image in so many buildings where uh, equipment that absolutely requires maintenance is so incredibly inaccessible. And
Yeah.
I don't, I think it's just been, the history of facility managers not being more prominent in the whole design and construction process, because, and it's just things out of sight and out of mind become out of mind. And that's a challenge. But I've also seen areas that equipment that absolutely needs filter changes or attention of some kind operationally is just so hard to access that it simply doesn't get accessed because of that. So again, this is thinking about risk long before it's actually built, that we take steps to put into the process and put into the specification these lessons we've learned from past buildings and past experience.
Well, actually, that's a wonderful point, and it's actually one of the bright spots that we've seen through the past even just couple of years, where more and more facility managers are really demanding data about their assets, right? They want to know what the condition of their fire sprinkler system is at the 10-year mark or at the 15-year mark before it's had any of these visible outcomes, visible problems like a leak, right? They want to know, they want the data to be able to proactively manage the life cycle. Like you mentioned, it's just akin to, rotating equipment and filter changes and things like that. Like, we've got a good grasp on what needs to be a proactive maintenance cycle for some of these things. Historically, we just have not had that with most of our fire sprinkler systems, but more and more facility managers today want to know so that they can, of course, take proactive steps to make sure that this degradation is limited, but also just to do their budgeting, to plan around operational downtime. Like, if you're in an auto manufacturing plant, you've got a 2-week shutdown during this period, you can get some work done if you need to, right? And so it's a really promising trend that we've seen with facility managers. They want this data, they want to pre-plan this stuff. But I think we've got a long way to go before the industry as a whole kind of um, really gets a hold of this mentality for the most people. But it's really promising that at least a small group of people are doing the right thing, and I hope it kind of permeates the rest of the industry very quickly.
Oh, yeah. No, I totally agree with that. I think that there are some very positive changes, learning changes underway right now because of that. So this just twigs with me the influence that technology can have, a positive influence technology can have within the whole uh, data capture, or in fact having digital data instead of hard copy filed somewhere where we can't find anymore. So how that can be a very positive tool for facility managers. But I'm also thinking about, in terms of technology, we are moving, well, the world is moving into a lot more AI, as we've all heard about, which and cloud computing and so on, which ultimately means that we're going to have a lot more data centers, and we then are so invested in these data centers with this computing power and protecting the assets. So, I mean, we've always dealt with buildings where assets are people and what they do, and now we're dealing with buildings whose assets are actually technology that help people do what they do. So I don't know if there is any particular difference in fire protection systems that need to protect technology, for instance. And right now, server rooms are the most common thing, but moving into data centers, that's a whole much larger challenge. Any insight into that?
Actually, one of our leading industries is data centers,
Oh,
and because they do take fire protection very seriously, um, and even more so, what makes data centers so keen on reducing this risk, right? Reducing risk of leaks, reducing risk of their fire sprinkler systems not working, is that the downtime is so critical for their operations, right? Like you mentioned, we're kind of moving all of this technology and computing power into these centralized data centers, and we're packing all this stuff into such a tight space. And that's great from a kind of operations perspective. I'm not an IT person, so I can't exactly speak on the details. But what that means for us is that any problems with the building systems that manifest themselves in a data center are very serious, because taking down a server rack is very expensive. Taking down this percentage of compute power for a certain data center is very expensive, and also they're secure facilities, right? And so doing work in them is challenging. Taking systems out of service is challenging, and all these things. And so, they are taking a very proactive stance on controlling for corrosion in their fire sprinkler systems. I think rightfully so, because that the risk is so high. What I think we're seeing on a more, a bigger trend in the industry is that, the data center folks have been keenly aware of the risk of downtime, the risk of damaging equipment for a while now. And so that's why they're kind of at the leading edge of all this stuff. But I think that we've got to kind of shift our mindset for other industries too, because so oftentimes we think of, well, what's it going to cost to repair this piece of equipment, or what's it going to cost to get a contractor in here to do this? Whereas other industries like data centers have really internalized the cost of downtime and disruption, other industries are kind of on the lagging end of that. And I think we could all do probably a better job with internalizing, if I have a problem in an X piece of equipment, let's say the fire sprinkler system in our example, how's that going to affect the other parts of the business? Is it gonna create more downtime? Is it going to damage other parts of the facility? Is it going to increase my risk for taking the system out of service, etc.? And I think if we did that, we'd all kind of have a better understanding of, how critical some of the lesser known or more overlooked systems in our buildings really have an impact on these things that could be, crucial to manage closely.
I think that's brilliant because ultimately facility managers have to compete yearly for operational budgets. They have to compete
Yep.
for capital budgets. And I think that rather than just speaking to the cost of doing this work, I think speaking to the cost of not doing this work is probably equally as persuasive. And I think that that's likely the kind of spreadsheet, speaking spreadsheet that facility managers actually need to engage with, because downtime is huge. And
Yeah.
that can actually, entail costs not even associated with the building. It has everything to do with business. And I think that, that's great to be aware of that.
Yeah, and if you just kind of jogged a little story in my head that just happened last week with a client we're working with. Um, you know, most the traditional kind of view of a sprinkler system is, you put it up in the air and then you forget about it, right? And if it goes wrong, I'll call somebody in here to fix a leak. Well, in some cases, in the client that we're working with, they have a system present and it's about 12 years old. So it's on the kind of early end, but it's having problems. And what happened was it had a leak and it actually flowed enough water to signal the water flow switch, which of course caused the strobes and the horns in the building to go off. What that did was it made everybody evacuate the building, right? Of course, there was no fire. It was just a small leak in the system. So there was no imminent danger to the folks, but everybody is doing the emergency response procedures as they're supposed to, and they got out of the building. I think they were out of the building for just under an hour. Well, there was several hundred people that worked at this facility, and so somebody did do the math. One of the facilities folks did do the math afterwards, and like, wow, if I tally up everybody's hourly rate, this was a production type facility. So if I tally up everybody's hourly rate and calculate it by the hour that they were outside in the parking lot doing nothing, what does that cause the business? And I think if you even just do that as a thought experiment, right? What would happen if I had to evacuate because there's a pinhole leak on my sprinkler system? I think the numbers will surprise you in how large they are. And I'll tell you this much, they will surprise the finance folks in your business much more than they'll surprise you. And they'll probably get those finance folks to be a little bit scared and potentially, positively impact your budget to make sure these things don't happen next year, right? When you have to go get your budget for next year.
Oh, that's such a great story, because that's absolutely the experience. And I think that, taking learning from what we've seen and what we are seeing as things change, and then taking the opportunity to apply it is actually what the message that we want to get out there to facility managers, and how to actually move the stewardship of buildings forward, because it's for the organization and the work that happens in them. And this is just adding more focus on what's really going on behind the scenes. So this is an invitation, I think, to invite facility managers to be front stage and center, so that it's not all behind the scenes, because it really does have either negative or positive impact in a huge way to organizations. So this has been another really interesting conversation. I really want to thank you, Mathias, for having this, behind the scenes insight into a lot of the work that happens in facility management in buildings that just doesn't get nearly the kind of attention that it should. So thanks very much for this. And I'm sure facility managers are going to take full advantage of this knowledge now.
Absolutely.